Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm very glad to be joined with this episode with Karin Hurt and David Dye. Karin Hurt helps human-centered leaders find clarity and uncertainty, drive innovation, and achieve breakthrough results. She is the founder and CEO of Let's Grow Leaders, along with David, a global leadership development firm known for practical tools and techniques for human-centered leaders. She's also a former Verizon wireless executive with more than 2 decades of experience in sales, customer service, and human resources. She is known for growing courageous leaders, building great cultures, and inspiring high-performance teams. And today I'm also joined by David Dye, who's CEO of the same company. He is the president of Let's Grow Leaders and a former executive himself. He is known for helping leaders and teams achieve transformational results without sacrificing their humanity. Thank you both for joining me today on the podcast.
Oh, Charles, it is absolutely our pleasure. We're delighted to be here.
Loved your presentation at ATD this year. So excited that you're part of the IMS family of educators now, and love to kind of dive deeper into your book today on courageous cultures. But my first question is always about kind of your background and really what got you interested on this topic. And feel free for one or both of you to comment.
You know, it was really interesting. We were doing work across a variety of industries all over the world with very senior leaders. And we would hear a frustration. Why don't more people speak up and share their ideas? Why do I discover these best practices while I'm walking around? Why aren't my middle managers, my frontline leaders hearing this stuff? And why aren't people solving more problems? They're the ones closest to the customer. What was really interesting is that we would go into the front line of those very same organizations and we would hear, nobody wants my ideas. Last time I spoke up, I got in trouble. Nothing ever happens anyway, so why bother? So we started a very extensive research study. It was quantitative and qualitative to answer a couple of questions. When people were holding back ideas, what kinds of ideas were they holding back? And it wasn't trivial. It wasn't kombucha in the break room or virtual Taco Tuesdays. They told us they were holding back ideas to improve the customer experience, the employee experience, or productivity in a process. And then we began the research of why were people holding back those ideas? And we can get into that as well. But that's really what sparked our interest in courageous cultures.
Oh, that's great. Well, why don't we define what is a courageous culture for our listeners? And I know you have a great definition of it in your book, but if you could just kind of explain that and unpack that a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with culture first. So what do we mean by culture? Our favorite definition of the word culture comes from marketing guru Seth Godin. And he says that culture is simply people like us do things like this. So that's culture in any organization. So in a courageous culture, it's easy to look at kind of the default. What is not a courageous culture? It's one of safe silence. People are not raising their hand. They're not solving problems. They're not contributing. Everybody's keeping their head down and staying what feels like safely silent. In a courageous culture, it's a culture of consistent contribution. Everyone, every day, raises their hand on behalf of the customer to solve problems, improve processes for the employee experience, the customer experience, improve the products and experiences all along the way. So it's one where that's the norm. That's what's happening as the default. And it's a culture that encourages that.
Well, in many organizations, that's not the default, right? I love that word, safe silence, or that phrase. And why do you think that is the default over consistent contribution?
Yeah, so what our research said was a couple of things. 40% said they lack the confidence to share their ideas. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is there may be what we call toxic courage crushers happening in the organization, things like shame, blame, and intimidation. And also things that impact confidence is that people haven't been taught how to speak up and share their ideas. They don't have practical ways to do that. Another is that 56% said they are afraid they would not get credit for sharing their ideas. And so there's not an acknowledgement when people are speaking up. And 67% said my manager operates around the notion of this is the way we've always done it. And so I'm not, why bother? And 50% said nothing's going to happen anyway. And so you've got all of those dynamics that are happening in an organization. And when we share that, and when we dug deeper for the qualitative and the different case studies that we in the research, people say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I have an open door. And, the problem with an open door is it still takes some level of courage for people to walk through it. And it is statistically likely that even if you are the most human-centered leader, which I imagine people really listening, you're choosing to listen to your IMS podcast, right, are human-centered leaders wanting to lead well, it is still statistically likely that people are holding on to a negative experience that they've had in the past. And it might not even be with you, and it might not even be with your organization. And so we need to be very deliberate and prepared to deal with that landscape.
Yeah, and when you're talking about kind of the default, the human psychology that's showing up in your team, Dr. Amy Edmondson, of course, you can't talk about this subject without referencing her work on psychological safety. And so that notion that Karin was just talking about of people hanging on to negative experiences, that is, we remember and hang on to those negative experiences far more than the positive. And so there's that. And a lot of people have those negative experiences. The other thing that she found is that people discount the potential positive benefit of an idea they might contribute. And so I may have an idea, but it's most people will immediately go, it's probably not going to make that big a difference. And I got work to do today, much less the courage to go talk to my boss about it and how that's going to be received. So without doing something differently from a leadership perspective, those are the headwinds. Those are the kind of the cultural inertia that you're working against just based in human psychology.
You're absolutely right. And one of the things that I've noticed too is that, and you mentioned this in your book as well, is that people tend to underestimate the future benefit to speaking up, right? And overestimate the current risk because they don't want to appear stupid or have their idea not acknowledged or someone else taking credit for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these barriers to a courageous culture, there are natural tendencies, but they're not set in stone. And I love what you say is when you ask many people what was the most courageous act they ever did, you notice that most of these stories didn't start with a capital C. They started with a lowercase c.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting as we were interviewing people, they would say, well, it didn't feel that courageous at the time. It was just something that I had to do. And so that, people are drawing courage from their values, from things that are deeply important. And I'm speaking up to defend someone, to do the right thing. And yeah, it wasn't big stories of whistleblowing. And, we do these big conferences. We always give people index cards and have them write down their big moments of courage. And they're not big with a capital C. They're small, but they felt big at the time, because people were overcoming that inertia. But you know what? I shared an idea. I questioned some data. I confronted a bully, but the thing is, when you do act in that way, according to your values, and you do take the risk to speak up, to share your ideas, to experiment with a new approach, to try something new, you gain more confidence for the next time. And it gets easier and easier. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is that in a courageous culture, it takes less daily courage to show up because it's just the way people like us do. And so if it is okay and welcomed in our culture to take appropriate risks, then it doesn't feel like it's a courageous thing for me to do to take an appropriate risk.
That's great. And it's somewhat counterintuitive what you mentioned is that these small acts of courage, right, they set the foundation for a courageous culture, right? It's not, like you said, not the big C courageous acts, but it's the smaller acts that build momentum day in and day out for you to behave more courageously moving forward.
And part of the courage, when we talk about the courage in a courageous culture, is really at the leadership level of the vulnerability to ask for ideas, to start that process. So if you create the culture where everyone's speaking up, where does the courage come in? It's because that you have a leader who's willing to ask and admit where they don't know and be transparent about that and bring the right questions rather than having all the answers.
Completely agree with that. Showing that bit of vulnerability really builds trust, and it starts with the leaders. So the leaders that get more out of their teams show that vulnerability, and it's really not a sign of weakness, right? And I think that's where some leaders think that, well, I don't want to show too much. Yes, I would agree with that. It's kind of like the Goldilocks principle. You want to show the right amount, but not showing any vulnerability at all is really not going to make you a very effective leader.
It was interesting. We were doing a courageous cultures type workshop in Europe recently. And this guy raised his hand and he said, I hear what you're saying about being vulnerable, but I've got to tell you, being vulnerable makes me very uncomfortable. And I just thought, you just became the most vulnerable person in the room, right? And so what we talked about there is, if you really, it doesn't only mean talking about your personal things that are going on. You have choices that you can make about that. But being vulnerable could be something like, this new process is difficult for me too. And I am really investing in learning how to do it right, but I don't find it easy, right? And so you've been vulnerable, you showed up human, because nobody wants to feel like they're working for a robot. And that connectedness is one of the key elements of really building trust. And building trust is at the foundation of having a courageous culture.
It is. And you mentioned a few other things: manage performance. The leaders need to advocate for their team, experiment with new ideas and approaches, and perhaps we'll get into a few of those later on. But turning the focus now to what are some of those common courage crushers that you've seen in organizations that really just eliminate courage or really make it difficult to have a courageous culture within your company?
Shame, blame, intimidation. I mean, obviously, if we're talking about things that are completely illegal, that's your starting line of let's get rid of all of that. But from there, it's where you get into shame, blame, intimidation, and fault finding and those kinds of things where, when something goes wrong or it doesn't work the way we intended or the way we hoped, if it's all about give me someone to blame, well, it's going to take all the courage a person possibly has just to show up and do their job. So you're not getting any of that discretionary creativity, problem solving, critical thinking, because I'm just using everything I have to survive here. So to be able to get rid of those and eliminate that and have a culture of, okay, yeah, we're going to take risks, and risks mean it's not always going to work. And we're going to celebrate positive contributory risks that are, risks taken with the right intention, not risks taken from, negligence or carelessness or something like that, but risks on behalf of the ultimate outcomes we're trying to achieve. We want to be acknowledging and rewarding those.
Good answer to that. It's something that I find that once you take the illegal stuff out, right, there's still a lot of obstacles in the way of many organizations developing this kind of courageous culture. And you mentioned that in your book, in order to build a courageous culture, you have to master the courageous culture cycle of clarity and curiosity. So perhaps we can first go through clarity and just give a definition of what you mean by clarity and some of the ways in which an individual or a company can build it.
Yeah, so I'll take clarity, David, and then give curiosity to you in the elegant dance that is clarity and curiosity. So clarity is really being clear about two things. One is clarity that you really do want people's ideas. And that, not just to have an open door, but that you really want a good idea. And the second is clarity about what a good idea would accomplish. And here's what has been so fascinating to us in the decade that we've been doing this kind of work with Let's Grow Leaders is we'll go in and people say, hey, you know what? My middle managers are just not critical thinkers. They don't get it. And when we peel back that and look underneath to go in and help, it's always they do not have enough strategic information to make critical decisions. So the first thing you can do when you create clarity is not just say, hey, I have an open door. Bring me any ideas you have to improve the organization. But instead say, here's where we're headed. And, getting ready for 2024. We've got 3 big initiatives. What I really need is your best thinking about how we nail this one. This is what success looks like for this initiative. Here's the parameters that a good idea, it can only spend this amount of money. It's got to include these people. And so you set that up. Because we tested our Courageous Cultures tools with a variety of ways, as we were building all this out. And sometimes we would say very generically, we bring people together, we take them through our idea incubator process, and they come up with great ideas. But 3 months later, none of them were implemented, right? So because they weren't strategically aligned with what the organization was passionate about. But when we started, did the exact same tools, the exact same processes, but began with a real strategic initiative or two where people really were open to having new ideas, what we found is the success rate of ideas actually being implemented was way, way better. So that's clarity.
Before we move on to curiosity, you also mentioned that it's broken up into a couple different parts, right? Safety, confidence, and direction. Is there a starting place to really get greater clarity and understanding what success looks like?
Yeah. So, so it's the safety that I really do want your ideas and being real about that. And part of that safety comes from not that just am I saying that, but how am I acting? Am I speaking up to my peers? Am I advocating for ideas upward? Or, am I really proving that it is safe? Right. And then confidence is really, having that clarity that, gives people the skills to be able to speak up and break that down in very practical ways. And I know you want to talk at the end about our idea methodology for positioning ideas, but making it super easy for people to feel confident because 40% lack the confidence to share their ideas. The best way to do that is give them some practical ways to do that, right? And so then give them the ability then to provide that towards a strategic direction like we've been talking about and making sure that you are aligning everybody's best thinking in a strategic way.
Great. So moving to curiosity and cultivating curiosity is not simply a matter of asking more questions, right?
There's certainly an asking element of it, but we like to say when it comes to this dance between clarity and curiosity, one of the most practical things to look at for your team or your organization is which one is stronger for you. Some teams and some organizations are high clarity organizations. There's a lot of rules, regulations, everything's defined out to the nth degree. Other organizations or teams, it's a very freewheeling, creative, curious kind. We're always asking, hey, what if? Let's try this. And so we say, start where you aren't. Whichever one is your strength, let's go work on the other. So when it comes to cultivating curiosity, going back to the research, one of the most fundamental, it's the easiest thing to do, and it doesn't take much time, is to ask what we call a courageous question. So as a leader, where do you most need a great idea? What's a problem you need to solve, a process you need to improve, an initiative you're needing to roll out, but it needs to be effective? Where is it you could most use a really constructive, valuable idea? Get clear on that yourself. Now we're going to go ask. And when we ask, that ask needs to be specific and it needs to be vulnerable. So Karin mentioned the open door issue earlier, and I had, just getting really practical in my career, had a situation where I was a COO and the CFO, CEO, we were in a room trying to solve a big financial problem regarding health insurance and some different things. We had spreadsheets all over the room, couple of hours, banged out a solution. We're like, yeah, we're feeling good. I walked down the hall and mentioned what we had come up with to executive assistant. And she says, oh, well, yeah, I see it. Okay. And then she thought it through and she said, you know how that's going to impact so-and-so and then so-and-so. And she just talked about a couple different people in the organization, just thinking it through in ways that we were not comfortable with. And it made it very clear, we are not done yet. We need to get back in the room. And more importantly, we need to have her with us because she had some good insight. She wasn't reluctant to share it. She didn't even know she had it to share. And so the power of asking a courageous question to tap into the best thing and get parallel processing going. If we're specific, it makes it easier for people to answer. So how specific can I get? What's one way that we can improve this process? If we could do one thing to remove one barrier or one obstacle for our customer to have a better experience in this segment of their journey, what would that be? So as specific and minute as we can get makes it easier for people to answer. And inherently in a courageous question is vulnerability. The vulnerability that there's room for improvement. And again, going back to the conversation we were talking about earlier, is that can be challenging, but it's essential if we want to get people's thinking and best ideas. That I don't have all the answers. I may have my own idea, but I want everyone's ideas. So acknowledging that improvement's possible, we can start to get some of those on the table and start bouncing. So like the fundamental kind of the atomic level, courageous culture activity, asking a courageous question, specific and vulnerable.
And that's why it combines with the clarity. A lot of times when we first start working with people in our leadership development programs, they say, well, I ask my team for feedback all the time. And well, how do you ask? Well, I say, what feedback do you have for me? How could I be a better leader? So they're being vulnerable and they're being courageous, but they're getting like, nah, man, you're doing just fine. I mean, consistently. So we encourage them to shift it to use a courageous question, which embeds the clarity. What is one way I could improve our communication on our team? Or what is one way I could make our meetings more effective? Now, when you do that, it's so much easier for people to answer because everybody has an opinion about meetings or communication. So you can start with the easier ones. And then you can work and you respond with regard, which we can talk about, but you respond well when they give you the idea. And then you can begin to make those courageous questions be a little more vulnerable. Okay, well, what's one way I could do better influencing my manager? So then you are continuing to build that culture. When you do that consistently, then if you say something like, is there anything I do to improve my leadership? You've already built and proven that you're acting on feedback. And you can also still say to people, and if there's anything else that you like, so that sometimes people worry they're too narrow, they're not going to get the real feedback. Well, then you can say, great. And always know if there's anything else, I'm wide open.
Well, it's important to establish that trust to begin with, right? Because I find a common problem with senior leaders is that they're not getting honest feedback, regardless of how they position it. Because people have a political agenda, right? They're not going to tell their boss if there's something that they really don't think their boss is ready to hear, or there's not the trust established in that relationship to hear that honest feedback. And to get better answers, ask better questions. But a lot of time too, the other big issue I see is that they just don't wait, right? And you put this as well, don't respond yet. Make sure that you allow them to answer it fully before you have this idea in your mind, or you interrupt them and you're not really listening and practicing those active listening skills of what they're actually trying to tell you and say. And so they feel understood before you feel like you need to chime in.
And one easy way to do that, we just finished watching season 2 of The Bear, and the owner of the restaurant, in his management style, one of the things that he says when he has a team member who's expressing something, and they'll just give a little bit, and he'll say more. And that's his way of doing it. But tell me more, say more. Oh, what else is there? And until they say, no, that's it, that's good, that's everything, we're not ready to respond yet. Let them get it all. So just something easy like say more, such a practical way of doing that.
When I recall in the coaching habit with Michael Bungay-Stanier, he was on the podcast last month, and one of those questions, and what else, right? Stay curious longer before you start chiming in. And you mentioned also that the most underappreciated is really how you respond. And a good response has really 3 elements, which I love to kind of just give an overview of, and that's gratitude, process, and invitation, right?
Yeah, this is probably my very favorite aspect of the book. And I know you're going to ask me for if I had one leave behind for everybody, it would be respond with regard. So here it is. When we ask for an idea, and this goes back to what you're saying earlier about how do we get the trust? If you're a senior leader, how do you establish, gosh, I really can be trusted with your feedback? That's a big deal. And so you're a leader and you're thinking, well, okay, yeah, it's easy to respond well to a great idea that's really going to make a difference. But what do I do with that crazy thing that I heard? Because I do get those, right? So here it is. Responding with regard, we're going to start with gratitude. Regardless of the content, if the person shared a contribution, a solution, an idea, something, we're going to say thank you. We're not thanking them for the idea. We're not acknowledging good, bad, indifferent of the quality of the idea. We're thanking them for their contribution, for the act of trying to improve things. So that's what I want to say thank you for. Thank you so much for thinking about how we can be better here. Really appreciate that. Then we're going to move to information. And this is where we're going to add information to the conversation depending on the kind of idea we got. If it's ready to be trialed and tested, hey, thank you so much for thinking about how we can improve. I think this idea is ready to get a test. Here's how we're going to do that. Here's where you can learn more. If the idea has already been implemented, we've talked to large organizations, half the ideas they get are things they're already doing. Okay, well, let's tell people that, hey, this idea is so good, it's already being used. Here's where you can learn more. If the idea is maybe half-baked or missing some information, we want to add that. Hey, appreciate you thinking about how we can improve here. Here's some additional information that would be helpful for you to know as you're thinking about this. We've got this budget constraint, this line item, this department has this competing priority, has to be satisfied in terms of thinking about this. We can't get any more resources in terms of money, but we might be able to do some people sharing. What information do we have to add to give them what they need to be thinking more critically? And then the fourth possibility is we're not going to use the idea. It's not strategically aligned. It's just something that can't happen right now or maybe ever. And we need to be honest about that and explain the why behind that. But then we get to the third step, which is an invitation. And the invitation is the conclusion of the conversation, which is we ask them to continue contributing. So thank you so much for thinking about how we can be better. Here's some additional information. I'd love to get your thoughts, if you have more time to think about that, on how you might incorporate that into your solution. No, we can't use this idea because strategically it goes this way. We're going this way. And I'd love to get your thoughts on how we can do this really well. Love to know what you have. And so as we're ending the conversation, inviting them to continue contributing, we're building that culture of ideas really are welcomed. I'm not going to use them all, but most adults can handle that when we feel heard and valued, recognized for the act of contributing, and invited to keep going and do it again.
And individuals need to feel understood before they're going to be willing to hear you. So that's so critical and important. And you're right, so many leaders don't do it well, if at all. And they feel like it's just something that's just not that critical. If they get the other stuff right, they'll be fine. But you're right, it's probably if not one of the most underappreciated things that I have witnessed as well personally with senior leaders.
Yeah. And Charles, here's the real irony of it. And we've noticed this, is that the closer people feel oh, I've been working with, we're in this startup and we've been working together for 5 years from the time we were a 3-person thing. And now we've gone to 200. My direct report team, we go way back. I can just, everybody's grown up here. So I'm just going to tell them, that idea sucks, right? And I will tell you, we hear it from those people who are being talked to that way. Even if you are really close, you got to respond with regard. We deal with this all the time. I have a lot of ideas and they can't all be implemented. And David has learned to say, wow, respond with regard. Because I'm like, wait a minute, are you kidding? No, don't just tell me it can't be done, right? So, and being married, right, it would be, we feel like maybe you could just be very straight with someone, but it still hurts my feelings and then it shuts you down.
Yeah, you don't want to let familiarity breed contempt. I mean, and that's the thing is, it's so easy to say that foundation of relationship allows you to discount somebody's idea just off the bat, and it doesn't.
And you might really miss a good idea. That's the other thing. Not only will you damage to the relationship, shut people down for the future, you might really miss a great idea because you haven't explored, stayed curious long enough.
That's true. And one leader told me once that he had an employee that really came in and just said, well, I'm just being honest. And she prefaced everything with that. And his response was, no, you're just being rude. And that's not an opportunity to respond that way and by couching it in those terms.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a good distinction. Yeah.
So the other big idea I love is, and I love for you to unpack, and you give a great story about Trader Joe's in the book, is practice the principle. So if you could maybe give the story of Trader Joe's and really how that illustrates practicing the principle and kind of defining that.
The principle is the idea. Let's take the opposite. So many times a leader will talk to, a team who says, hey, this is what we're doing over here. And they have a nice little innovation. And the leader just immediately grabs a hold of the practice and immediately rolls it out. Everyone's going to do this now. And it doesn't work. People are resentful. It falls on its face. They're like, how could that person be so dumb and disconnected? The problem there is that they're taking a practice out of context and then just applying it willy-nilly across the board. Practice the principle means get underneath. Why did that practice work? What's the principle underneath it? And sometimes you have to dig a little bit. So, I had, we talk about a person who they cooked a huge, they were an Italian chef, Italian heritage, and they cooked this huge meal for their team every year as part of their annual kickoff. And people in the same role in other teams felt bad. And I was doing some coaching work with them and I'm like, what's going on? She's like, well, I can't cook like that. There's no way I can do that. I can't replicate that. And that's missing. The practice is not cook your team a big Italian feast. The practice is show up with some heart and connection that works for you and give of yourself whatever you are. That's the principle underneath it. So how do we replicate and spread the principle? Okay, over to Trader Joe's.
Yeah. So, so if you've been to a Trader Joe's, where, there is an atmosphere that is consistent. It is customer centric and it is fun, but it's not always the same. And so I was at a Trader Joe's there was an impending snowstorm, and we live in Maryland, and Maryland is not great at snow, especially big snow. So everybody freaks out. So this Trader Joe's, everybody's been in that grocery store, right? Something has gone wrong with her. So there's lines all the way down the aisles. And then they're having system malfunctions with the cash, some of the cashier. So people now, of course, people are going to get agitated. Everybody's worried about getting out of there and getting home safely before the snow really comes in. And I just watched the store manager do such a brilliant job of as if he were orchestrating this whole chaotic scene. He gets on, they have these microphones, and he gets on and he starts playing games, and he's like, okay, number 7, if you're number 7 in the line, go and you can go pick out any item that you want and bring it back, and and we'll do that. And then other things that he was encouraging people to be friendly and supportive. I've got to shift this line to this line, but anybody who shifted this line to this line gets this as a reward. And he spent some money, but that customer, that what he was practicing the principle of is create a fun environment and be focused on the customer. And now, if they can't possibly go and now say to every Trader Joe's, if there is a snowstorm and if it's going to be over 2 feet, and if it's in a warm climate where people are not used to the snow, then you may spend up to $500 giving away free, yogurt. You're not going to do that. But what you can say to your managers, which I imagine somehow in their training you must do this, is you do have flexibility. There is a certain amount of your budget. And if you need to do something to make it right and to spend a little bit of money, you have this amount of money to do, and get creative. In the book, we also talk about a sales team example where selling to people in Cedar Bluff, Virginia, which is a very, very small rural town, and selling to people in Washington, D.C. is a radically different experience of what people really value and need. But what you can say is the principle is this is what this is going to be our approach. We need to sell in this way. We need to sell these products. And now you figure out the best way to do that. And so that's really, I think, the rookie managers often, they find a best practice and they say, now everybody needs to do it like Charles, because Charles is our best salesperson. So I watch Charles make these calls like this. He says these words. He does these things. Instead, you're better off saying, what's really underneath what Charles is doing that's so good? And how do I then go to my team and say, okay, what he's really doing here is showing up with empathy. What is a way that feels really comfortable for you to show up with empathy, or whatever the thing is?
And it's committing yourself to finding that core idea, which may not be easy at times, and then identifying the best practices and helping your team, like you said, localize best practices for their unique circumstances. I reminded of Herb Keller at Southwest, where in one of his books, it was his mantra is, we are going to be the low-cost airline. Now, what does that mean to a flight attendant versus someone at the gate versus a pilot? Might be different, that they can localize that, but that's that guiding mantra. That's what had a retired Army general on the podcast a while back. That's commander's intent, right? Where the plan may change, but the intent is still there. And it's up to you to really identify what that means within your role.
Yeah. And if people lack common sense, right, it's probably they don't understand that commander's intent. And so you need to get back more to that clarity of vision, so that they know how to choose the right behaviors that are going to, because you can't teach someone how to react in every situation. And every time you do that, like the people who script for contact centers and people are reading from a script, they actually destroy the customer experience, because they're not teaching intent. They're trying to over micromanage.
And responding with regard is a practical way that you can help coach, redirect, and guide people towards that, and learn how to think about it as they are bringing ideas, as opposed to, oh, we tried that, it won't work. Or, yeah, that's not going to happen here. Get back to work.
I agree. What if you have a bunch of individuals, which you call, which I love because there's a lot of these individuals in the book, on just tell me what to do? Maybe they don't feel confident in sharing their ideas. So if you want to get better ideas out of those employees, and so they know how to differentiate a good idea from a bad idea, then you have a great framework. That's the acronym IDEA. Perhaps you could just go through that for our listeners to give them insight for this framework and this approach.
This is also for any of your listeners who may not even be managers yet, and they have ideas to share, right? So you teach people how. One way to give people confidence in sharing their ideas is say, answer these 4 questions. Why is this idea interesting? And why does this idea strategically aligned with where we're headed? And when we practice this in workshops, we say, make the first sentence that you say something that is going to be so compelling that if an executive is half listening to you, is on their phone, they're going to put down their phone and listen to you. So I have an idea that could save us $10,000. Okay, that's good. Our child came to me yesterday and says, Mom, I have an idea that maybe could let me go to college for free. Well, I am listening to that, right? D, doable. And this is where, have they thought it through, why this idea is practical? And, so I have an idea. It's going to save us $10,000. I've thought through, it would take us these 3 steps. And you don't have to have thought the whole thing through, but just to show that it is a doable action. E, engaging. And this is, who else might you need to involve, engage? This is where you're teaching people to at least think about stakeholders. So, okay, this is on a continuum of these just tell me what to do. So if somebody's really reluctant, you're not going to say, no, you got to have done all the stakeholdering. But along the line, you can teach them how to do that. Is this who needs to be involved? Well, you probably need to talk to finance. You might need to talk to IT. You might need to talk to HR. You might need to talk to the person in the queue next to you to see if they think it's a good idea. Right? And so you get them to think about the idea in its natural habitat. And then finally, A, actions. And this is, what are your recommended next steps? And that sounds like a lot, but it could be very easy. Hey, I have an idea that's going to save us $10,000. Here's how I think we can pull it off. We need to do A, B, and C. I've already talked to HR. They said, no problem. It's not violating any of our policies. And here's what I recommend we do first.
Great framework to help employees really differentiate and identify good ideas and provide a framework, a kind of a script for them to go by, because I find that very valuable, not only for new and emerging leaders, but mid-level leaders, senior level leaders. If they have that script, then it makes it easier to change that behavior. The other type of individual that I see a lot in organizations that you address as well is they don't want to think and solve problems, right? They just want to come to you with this issue and just sit there until you've provided a solution. You have a great tool called the 9 What's coaching questions, which will hopefully help them problem solve on their own before they come to you with that request, or at least give you some possible solutions, right?
The old saw in management is, don't bring me a problem, bring me a solution. Right? One time somebody said, don't bring me a problem, bring me donuts. So I guess that's an option too. But the problem is, if we tell somebody that, don't bring me a problem, bring me a solution, and they don't know how to come up with a solution, we've just told them, don't bring me a problem. And now that problem goes unsolved, unaddressed, it festers, and the person isn't growing or learning. On the other hand, early in my management career, I was the manager who, you bring me a problem, I'm giving you answers. Either because, I just moved, get you out of my office, or look at how smart I am, or look at how helpful I am, or whatever it is. And all that they have learned is that I'll do their thinking for them. And if you have 5 people like that on your team, now you don't have any time for your own work. So the way to address that is to ask some questions to help them develop their own critical thinking and problem solving skills. And that's what those 9 what's are that you mentioned. So just briefly, the first 3 are all about gathering facts. So what's your goal? What have you tried? And what happened when you tried that? So just letting somebody assess, okay, what's actually going on here, and we make sure we're on the same page, getting back to clarity. Then we switch over to the curiosity. All right, so what'd you learn from that? And create some space for people to reflect on their own experience. Because in the hustle and bustle, often that's all it takes. Just some pause, some mental space, and, oh, what did I learn? Yeah, I think I'll try this. See ya. And they're off and running. Maybe not. If they keep going, we're going to say, all right, what other skills or training do you need in order to succeed here? Just because somebody's been trained doesn't mean they have everything they need. So let's make sure they're not missing something. And then what else can you try here? And when you ask that, you're going to get either some options. I've been thinking about A or B, or you're going to get an I don't know. And if you get an I don't know, we'll come back to that in just a sec. So as we're getting curious, asking those questions, what'd you learn? What else do you need? What else can you do? Then we're going to move, if they have some options, some things to think about, we're going to help them explore the consequences by saying, what do you think would happen if you tried option A or option B? And they walk through the consequences as they understand them. If they're missing some critical information, we add that in. We don't tell them what to do. We just give them information. Ultimately, then we're asking, this is the 8th question, so what will you do? And so if you're counting, like, these are 9 whats, all of the questions begin with the word what. What's your goal? What have you tried? What happened? What'd you learn? What else do you need? What can you try? What are you going to do? If you get an I don't know along the way, that's where the 9th question comes in. And that is to say, okay, well, I hear you don't know. What might you do if you did know? And that is a question that addresses a number of reasons people say, I don't know. The most common reason people say, I don't know, is because they're reluctant. They don't want to disappoint you. They haven't fully thought it through. They're not confident in their own data. So when we say, what might you try if you did know, we're creating some space with tentative language for them to explore. Makes it safe for them to play and think it through. For the person who, like you were saying, is like, I just don't want to think about it, I'm reflecting that back to them. And it's now, okay. And they'll say something like, if I didn't, I haven't thought about it, David. Okay, great. I'd like you to think about it. And then let's get together at 3 tomorrow and let's hear 2 or 3 ideas. All right. And so the person who truly doesn't know, they'll dig and they're coming up empty. And then we know there's some more training, equipping, or some experientially something else that they're going to need. So it helps us identify how to help that person. A couple of cycles through that, it can take 3 to 4, maybe 5 times of running people through those questions before they start to figure it out. Oh, you're not going to give me an answer. You're going to walk me through those questions, aren't you? That's right, I am. So what's the first question? And you start coaching them into self-coaching, and now they're developing their critical thinking and problem-solving skills and coming up with those solutions, doing their own thinking so you can focus on the work as a leader that only you can do.
Another IMS educator once told me that when you ask, so if you knew what to do, what would it be? And then just sit there with that expectant look and pause, right? And you'll be amazed if you can outlast them, some of those solutions that come to mind. And you're like, well, where was that a few minutes ago, right? It just magically appeared, because you don't want to create codependent relationships with your team, with your employees.
And realistically, sometimes time is of the essence. You have a customer on the line or something. We need to give them the answer. And then we can use this process afterwards to help them diagnose, okay, how could I have got there in that moment? So we're still skill building.
That's a great approach as well on the back end to really reinforce these concepts. Well, thank you both for joining me today. Really appreciate it. It's been a great episode. I always like to ask at the end of every episode, if there's one thing leaders could start with right now to build more courageous cultures, what would that one thing be?
Yeah, so I would start with clarity about where you really need a great idea, and then go ask a courageous question that is specific and humble.
And it will be no surprise that I'm going to say, be on the lookout for any idea, any contribution that you can respond with regard, with gratitude, more information, and an invitation to continue contributing. That will build momentum.
And just to wrap all that together, we always say, be the leader you want your boss to be. So don't wait and say, I wish I lived in a courageous culture. I wish my boss would ask me for ideas. Figure out that where you have influence and start there. And people then will begin to notice what you're doing and say, hey, why are you getting those great results? And then you can help to spread the culture.
Great. Be the change that you want to see in the world. Thank you so much for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with both of you.
Yeah, so we are Let's Grow Leaders, and our website is letsgrowleaders.com. And we write a weekly blog. David has a podcast. I have a LinkedIn video show. So there's so many ways. So we'd love for you to visit our website and also connect with us on LinkedIn.
If you like this episode, then please share it on social media and consider leaving a review or rating. If there are specific leadership topics or industry leaders you'd like us to feature on the podcast, we are welcome to your suggestions. Remember, knowledge's transformative power is only activated when it is acted upon. So what actions are you going to take on the insights and knowledge shared in this episode?